Okay, well, hey, thank you everybody for coming. I'm very excited to have David with us today. He's the CEO and co-founder of Retrium, which is an online platform for effective and fun agile retrospectives. So you like that word fun for agile retrospectives. So he's going to be leading us through how he views retrospectives and what he's seen that works really well. And since he's actually made an application to do it, it should be a pretty good, I think it'll be a very good viewpoint of how to do things. He's also one of the authors of the second edition of the book Agile Retrospectives, a practical guide for catalyzing teams, learning, and improvement. He's got a master's in technology management from the University of Pennsylvania and the Wharton School of Business, and he also has undergrad degrees in both computer science and economics from the University of Maryland. I will post some links, how you can get in contact with him, as well as a link to the book in the chat in just a second. But I think we'll turn it over to you, David. Looking forward to see what you've got to say.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much, Mark, for having me. I'm really excited to be here. And I'm not just saying that because that's what speakers tend to say at the start of talks. Retrospectives truly are one of my loves in life, and I'm going to get into why that is during this talk. It is also the case that for many of us, myself included, they sometimes don't live up to their billing. So we're going to talk about why that is and what we can do to get out of that. But before we get too far into this, just a little bit about myself. Mark mentioned a bit here. I am the CEO and co-founder of Retrium. We are not a consulting company. We're not an agile coaching company. You can't hire us as individuals. It's a software platform that helps you run more effective retrospectives in the retrospective itself, live meeting retrospectives. So check it out if you're struggling with them. Also, as of 1 week ago today, I'm now a published author. So Agile Retrospectives, the second edition of that best-selling book that was initially was released 15 years ago by Diana Larson and Esther Derby, was just released, the second edition, last week. I'm really excited about that. It covers a lot of new topics like how to run hybrid and remote retrospectives, how to use data effectively, some example plans for effective retrospectives. So you can check that out also. And then finally, I have pictures of little kids there at the bottom because in addition to the company and the book, I have 4 little children at home. So the ages are 11, 9, 7, and almost 5. She likes to say 4.5, but it's actually almost 5. So quite a busy household. This is my life. This is everything that I love to do in life is here on this screen. And I'm hoping to impart some of my passion and some of the things that I've learned over the past 20 years in this space to all of you today. Just in the form of kind of housekeeping here, you can submit questions at any time into the WebEx Q&A. Mark has promised me that he is going to be monitoring that Q&A, and if anything interesting comes up there, he'll interrupt me. I'm a pretty informal guy, so any question really at any time is just fine. There are some logical points during the talk when it makes sense to take a break, see what is going on with all of you, and whether you have questions that apply to what I just spoke about. So there will be time reserved for all of that. And then at the very end of the talk, also, I'll try to reserve some time for questions about whatever comes to mind. All right, let me jump in. Before I start talking about retrospectives from my perspective, I want to hear from all of you. So I want to know, this talk will be a success for you if I learn something about. And you can go ahead and type, I believe, into the chat. Is that right, Mark? Can they type into a chat here? Yeah. So go ahead and type into the chat. Just, this will be a success if I get blank out of this talk. Or if you're really brave and want to turn off your video or unmute yourself, feel free to do that also and shout it out. I'm a fan of interactivity here. But I just want to get a sense of what are you looking to get out of this talk? Okay, how to handle complaining better. More people smiling. Okay, sounds like appreciative retrospectives. Yeah, engagement. How to get team engaged. It's always one of the top things I hear. Hear psychological safety, actionable results, great. Action and engagement. I saw psychological safety, empowering the team. This is great. Bringing up topics that can be actionable, honesty. So I've given this talk many, many times, and it's almost always that 3 things pop up when I ask this question. And feel free to keep sharing. It is interesting to see. The first thing that I see all the time is a lack of engagement with retrospectives. People just say, we show up and no one participates, and it seems like a waste of time as a result. So we're seeing that in the comments here, lack of engagement. The second one that I hear time and again is low psychological safety, which shows up in the form of, hey, we're here physically, but we're not here mentally, because we're not sharing what we are actually thinking. There's some fear or some amount of being scared, some reason why we're not sharing what we actually think. So low psychological safety is the second one. And then the third thing that I hear all the time is a lack of follow through or a lack of action. We run a really well-oiled retrospective, but we're not following through on what we talked about. And so what's the point? Right? So you all are hitting on the main three things that I hear time and again. And this talk is going to cover many ideas as to how to overcome some of those challenges. So that's great. And if I don't hit on anything that you want to hear, then there'll be time at the end to ask me questions about that. But let's start just with the basics for a moment to make sure we're all on the same page. So what is a retrospective? The definition of a retrospective to me is simple. It's just an opportunity for your team to reflect on what has occurred and to construct ways to become better going forward. So it's a look back to improve what's ahead of you. Now, retrospectives are, in my mind at least, the very core of agility. They truly catalyze agility. And the reason for that is simple. If I were to define agile in just 2 words, those 2 words would be continuous improvement. That's it. Everything else about agile should feed the continuous improvement engine. And if you find yourself doing anything in your day-to-day that isn't leading towards continuous improvement, you might want to retrospect about it and find out, well, why? And how can we shift course? Why keep making the same mistake again and again? So retrospectives are the core of agility because if agility is all about continuous improvement, then the retrospective is this regularly scheduled meeting opportunity for you and your team to learn together how to improve. In fact, I like to say that if we knew nothing about Agile at all, nothing at all, except we knew how to run the best retrospectives in the world, we could use the retro to discover everything else we need to know about Agile to become successful. And that to me is why they're really at the core, the heart of agility. The problem is, and this is the subtext on the bottom right there of this screen, what I just said is true in theory, but we're all here for a reason today because they're hard to run well. So while retrospectives in theory lead to agility, the ones many of us do in practice might have the opposite effect, actually. We're going to get into that in a minute later. And part of the problem that I see time and again is what I call the retrospective cycle of disillusionment. And it goes something like this. We run a retrospective. All intentions are good. We show up and we start talking about some stuff. And there's a good conversation. And at the end of the retrospective, maybe we're even smart enough to come up with 1 or more actions to work on in the upcoming iteration or sprint. We go home for the weekend, we come back Monday morning. And all of a sudden, we get into the thick of working on the real work, which I'll put in air quotes there, as if retrospectives weren't real, but the real work. And maybe there's some deadlines that our boss has imposed on us, or some fire is lit in the production server, and we get very distracted. And the iteration goes through, and all of a sudden it finishes, and it's time for the next retrospective. And we look back and we realize, oops, we didn't do anything that we talked about in the first one, and yet here we are in the next one. Well, the logical response to that is a little bit less engagement in the retrospective. Because if the first one didn't work, then I'm not going to care quite as much about the second one. And the problem with that, even though it's somewhat of a logical response, is that the less you care, the less engaged you are, the less your retrospective is going to lead to good conversation, and the less it's going to lead to true action that the team can commit to, which again leads to less of an odds of follow through in the upcoming iteration, and so on and so forth, until you end up in this point where people say, why are we even running these things? I mean, we're just kind of here to talk, but we don't do anything. They don't change anything. Let's just skip it this time. We're too busy. And so this cycle of disillusionment leads to something that is really problematic for all of us who care about learning and growth and improvement, which is that once we get disengaged with the retro, it becomes logical not to run them anymore. So this talk largely is focused on how to overcome that cycle of disillusionment. How can we get out of that downward spiral that so many of us are in? You can give a thumbs up if that hits the nail on the head for you, right? If you're like, yep, that's me, or I know people who are in that zone of disillusionment, we just don't really believe in these things, so let's skip it. Just give a thumbs up. And usually when I do this talk in person, I'll say, raise your hand, and it's like 75% of the people in the room. Yeah, it's like, that's me. And guess what? I've been there. There's no shame in this. This is par for the course, but let's fix it, right? Okay. Retrospectives are really hard to get right. And they're hard to get right for one reason, which is that they stand on 3 equally important legs, what I call the triangle of success. And those 3 are people. You have to get the right people in the room. Process. You have to facilitate the meeting in a way that encourages engagement. And follow through, which is once you have the right people in the room, and once you're following a good process, if you're not following through on the actions, then you're probably wasting your time. And what makes retrospective so difficult is that if any one of these 3 things falls down, then you're not going to have an effective retro. Just as one example here, let's say we get the right people in the room. This is the set of people to tackle this important topic. But there's no one in the room who knows how to facilitate an effective retrospective. And it's just kind of an open conversation. It will end up that the most senior people in the room speak the most, or maybe the most extroverted people in the room speak the most. But it probably won't get the broad swath of ideas that we really need to glean all of the intelligence in the room from everybody. It probably won't lead to action because we're just having an open conversation, right? So you need to facilitate the retro effectively. And that's just one of these three legs. You can go through the same exercise and say, yeah, we're not inviting the right people into the room, or we're not following through. And if any one of these three legs falls down, the retro won't work. So the structure of the talk is I'm going to go through each one of these three. How do we get the right people in the room? How to facilitate the retro effectively once the right people are in the room? And finally, how to follow through on the retrospective to lead to action and change. Everyone with me so far? Does anyone have any questions before I keep going? I'm getting a thumbs up from Mark. That's good. Cool. All right. Let's start, first of all, with people. So the first leg of that triangle. How do you get the right people in the room? Well, that starts with knowing who are the right people in the first place to invite. So I'm going to throw out what I call rules. They're not really rules in that you can't violate them, or you might end up in some place you don't want to be. Rules are not really rules. They're more gentle suggestions of what I've seen to be effective. So hold them lightly. But what I've seen to be effective is that, guess what? Retros are for the team. Now, this might sound trivial, but let me ask you a question. Who's on the team, right? Who's on your team? In many cases, that's actually somewhat more amorphous than you might initially think. Some cases, it's very clear, but not always. Now, it's usually not your boss. Now, maybe they're on your team somewhat, but they're not doing the work with you. They're not actually on the team. And it's usually not the stakeholders who sponsor the project. They're not on the team. It's not even your Agile coach, actually, who might be helping your team, but not on the team. It's for the team. So who are they? If you're using Scrum, and that's a big if because not everybody is, actually the Scrum Guide answers that question. There's three types of team members. There's the Scrum Master, there's the Product Owner, and there's everybody else, the people who are on the development team. And that can involve a lot of different functions. Okay, but in your case, it might be different. Maybe you're not using Scrum, maybe you're using something else. No matter, invite the people on your team. Now, as soon as I just said that, probably lots of people are thinking, in my case, it might be a little bit different. And guess what? You're right. Because the second rule here is to completely ignore everything I just said. The second rule is to use your brain, because there's many cases when actually inviting your boss or inviting your stakeholder or inviting your Agile coach or anybody else in the organization might make a lot of sense. So some of us are, just take our 2-day certification course in Scrum, right? And it comes out saying that, oh, here's exactly how you follow the Scrum Guide. This is our rules. We follow all these things. That's a great starting place, but don't stop there. Make sure you're using your brain to make sure that you invite the right people to the retro. Okay, rule 3 is, now that you have kind of the right people there, whoever's on the team, whoever makes sense for the context of your conversation, you have to choose who is going to facilitate and who is going to participate, but ensure, ideally, that one person's not doing both. So let me give you an example. The facilitator is responsible for the context of the conversation. It's how the conversation is proceeding. It's, are we having sticky notes on the wall? Or is this going to be more of breakout rooms today for this retrospective? It's, are we going to come up with one action, or are we going to try to tackle lots of different topics? It's the how, the context of the conversation. Participants are responsible for the content of the conversation. It's what we're talking about in the context that the facilitator established. Now, it makes it really hard to do both, because if you're worrying and focusing so much on how we're having the conversation, it's hard to get out of that mode and start to participate as someone who's sharing content as well. So what I like to do to overcome that challenge, because realistically, sometimes we are responsible for both. We can't be in that ivory tower world where, okay, today I'm not going to contribute because I'm facilitating a retro and that's all I'm going to do, is I actually bring a physical hat that says facilitator on it. Right? And I wear it. I actually wear it to my retro. And if I'm facilitating in that moment, I wear that hat. And the moment I want to indicate to everyone I'm no longer facilitating, I'm now, just like you, I'm participating in this conversation, I take it off. Now that might sound a little silly or kind of glib, but it actually helps a lot to give people in the room awareness of what role you're currently taking. When you're facilitating, you don't want to bias the conversation with your content. But if you have something valuable to share, you don't want to not share that because you're facilitating. It helps you balance both. Okay, rule 4 on people is, if one person is remote, Everybody is remote. So before COVID, this was more controversial. I think since COVID, people get a lot more how if one person is remote from the team, it makes the entire team feel a little bit more distributed from one another. I mean, let me ask you a question right now. Who on this call is the remote person? Not really answerable, right? We all are remote from each other. Now, let me ask you another question. If all of you were in the same room, a physical conference room, and I was calling in to give this presentation, who's the remote person? In my view, at least, it's equally impossible to answer that question because we're both remote from one another. Now, why do I get into this? Because when you have a remote team and you try to run a retrospective, if you're treating people like you're in person when you're actually remote, meaning one or more people are remote, you're going to run into a lot of problems because physically in-person teams will use physical tools like sticky notes and flip charts and markers. But if one person is remote from that context, it's very hard for that person to participate. None of this is news for all of you. What I want to make sure that we all realize is that if you're running retrospectives just using WebEx, or if you're running retrospectives just using Zoom or any other conference call solution without some way of mimicking the in-person sticky notes that you probably would use if you were in person, you're missing out on something. Now, there's a whole host of tooling options that exist out there. My job today is not to tell you to use this one or another one. I just want to give you a lay of the land of how to pick, okay? On the left in this chart are general purpose tools, like Miro, or Mural could be on here too, even Google Docs, that are not built specifically for retrospectives, but can be used for collaboration. They offer high flexibility. You can do whatever you want in a Miro whiteboard, right? And many of you who use it probably would acknowledge that's the case. It's limitless. You can design whatever experience you'd like. But that comes at a cost, which is you have to design whatever experience you'd like. And for most of us who are busy, we have a lot of things going on, that sort of setup cost is actually quite high. So the tools on the left are great for the 5% of people who are experienced facilitators and who have the time to make sure that they're going to design the right experience in these general purpose tools. On the right-hand side of the screen are tools that offer out-of-the-box retrospective specific structure, like Retrium, that let you facilitate a retro without having to think about how to design it. So I'm going to show you just a quick example of what that looks like. Let me flip to this screen here. Mark, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see a browser window now instead of, yeah? Okay, cool. This is a page on Retrium that is a demo. I'm not here with a real team, right? So this is just a demo with bots, so not real people behind the scene. I'm going to click a technique called Start, Stop, Continue, which maybe you've used before to facilitate a retrospective. I'm just going to click Start. And the experience is such that people can start to create notes on the board without you having to set up the board at all. And you'll notice these bots who are creating boards here are doing so in a private way. As they're typing, you can see that they're typing. You see their blurred out content, but not what it is that they're typing. And the idea here is to give you that sense that people are all in the same room here, physical room, even though it's a remote room, and you can see there's activity. But you can't actually see what it is that they're typing, which lets you have time and space to brainstorm on your own. Again, this is just set up for you out of the box. So I'm going to start typing something here like plant in my garden, right? Doesn't matter what I say. Now, once there's some notes on the board, you can click this proceed to the group phase button here, which gets you to the next phase of the retrospective, where you can group like notes together to create topics of conversation. This is similar to how you might facilitate a retro were you in person. And you can see, I can pick up a note and I can drag it on another one to indicate that's a title. So something to talk about. The reason I'm going through all of this is to show you that I didn't have to do anything to set up this board. It just, you picked a technique and it understood what that means in the context of a retrospective. So I wanted to show that. I'm going to flip back now to the presentation to show you the difference between an empty Google Doc or an empty Miro whiteboard canvas and a pre-built experience. And you have to pick the tool that's best for you. Okay, to recap rules about the people. So number 1 is retrospectives are for the team. Number 2 is ignore that, use your brain. Number 3 is facilitate or participate is up to you, but pick one and make it visually obvious when you're switching between the two of them. And rule 4 is if one person is remote, everyone is remote. So make sure you pick a tool that supports your remote team. Okay, I'm going to pause. This is one of those logical stopping points to ask any questions that popped up that I can answer before I move on to the next part of the talk.
So I'm not seeing anything in Slido. Don't forget you can put things there and vote for it. But does anyone have any other questions? You can type it in the chat or just speak up about what he's covered so far. I love the hat idea, by the way. That's great.
Helps. Yeah.
Yes, I have a question. My question is, as a Scrum Master, I'm in the retro, basically facilitating and running it. I take it to understand that from what you've said, I should not be a person that puts items on the board or participates in the discussions because I'm going to facilitate.
Right. So it's a good question because on most teams like yours, the Scrum Master is on the team and likely has ideas to share. And to not share them would be doing a disservice to the rest of your team. So how do you balance those two goals? One is you're responsible for the context, the facilitation. The other is I have ideas I want to share. So what I'm suggesting is not don't put your ideas on the board, right? Absolutely put them up there. If you have something to share, put them up there. What I'm suggesting is during the conversation itself, right? After you're done brainstorming and people start talking about what it is that the group wants to talk about, there are times when you're going to need to act as a facilitator. Like, hey, we haven't heard from X in a while. How about you, right? Or, hey, there's the time box is 10 minutes left. So do we want to move on to the next topic? These are not the content of the conversation, but these are things that facilitators do, the context of the conversation. So wear that hat during those moments. And when it's time for you to participate, take it off so that people know that you are now a participant in the conversation. You're not the one facilitating. And I'll say one more thing about that. The value there is if you're a facilitator who's also trying to convince the room of your point of view, how you facilitate the retro will be biased by what it is you're trying to convince people to do. And people who see you doing that will lose some amount of faith that this is a fair way of facilitating the conversation. So just try to make it visually distinct when you're alternating between the roles.
Okay, thank you.
And I see Ian had a comment that he's curious what you think of this, David, letting other people facilitate the retro, not just the Scrum Master, so the Scrum Master can fully participate in the retro occasionally.
100%. Yeah, I think I might have a slide on that later. I'm not sure because I do a lot of these presentations. I don't remember, but I think so. And yes, the role of the facilitator is actually not the Scrum Master's role, believe it or not. The Scrum Master is someone who is a servant leader of the team. And if it's in the best interest of the team for someone else to facilitate, then that's a great idea. And in many cases, some of the highest performing teams I've seen rotate that role so that lots of people have an opportunity to facilitate and lots of people have an opportunity to participate. It's a great suggestion. I love it.
Hey, Tizzy, did you have a question?
Maybe more like a comment. I just wanted to underline that how important it is for the for who attends the retro to be something that the team is on board with and endorses. I have an example of a situation where invitations were sent out for a retro for a fairly new team, and there were a bunch of leadership level people on the invite. um didn't lead to any chaos or anything, but it's something that I just think it's important because if a team starts off and they're new to the framework or agile or whatever, and in that first retro there's people who aren't in the team and they had no say in it, they weren't asked, that may set a certain tone. And they may think, well, okay, I guess this is not a meeting where I can sort of speak so freely, and maybe this meeting is different in intention from what I thought it was. So long story short, I think that the whole idea of the team inviting who they want to is, I'm completely on board with that, but it should definitely be by invitation when others outside the team are in that space.
It's great. I love that you brought that up. 100% agree. To me, the default is whoever the team defines as the team. Anytime you deviate from that, the team has to bottom up select who those people are and agree that that's the right move for the team. I could not agree more. Okay, I think I'm going to keep going in the interest of time. Again, I'm trying to reserve time at the end also for questions, so keep them coming. So we're going to move on from people to process. This is how you facilitate the retrospective itself. First rule, and this one sounds again silly, but you're going to see why it's not in a minute, is to use facilitation techniques, okay? So what I'm going to ask you to do is the following. Let's run a retrospective on this talk so far. Maybe you get the point. Literally having no facilitation leads to awkward silence. No one knows what to do in that situation, right? Mark is on video, so I can see he starts to laugh in an uncomfortable way. And yeah, there's the emoji version of that. Because no facilitation leads to, I don't know what I'm supposed to do next. So a lot of times I've heard engineers and developers will push back, why do we need these silly facilitation techniques? And well, the answer to that is it's almost like an algorithm. You could try to speak in their language, right? It's almost like an algorithm to get to the most important topic to discuss for the team. And it's an algorithm for how to talk about it most effectively, right? Okay, so that's an example of what literally no facilitation looks like. Somewhat better than that would be a prompt. Like, one thing I like about this talk so far is, okay, now everybody at least has the opportunity to think about the same thing. We're all working on one topic together. And that can lead to improvement on how we facilitate the retro. That's better than coming in blind. But there's a much, much better way of facilitating retrospectives. And that looks like this. Can you raise your hand if you've seen this diagram before? Okay, so I'm getting a couple people here who've raised their hand, which is great. This comes straight out of the first edition and the second edition of the book that I'm now a co-author on with Diana and Esther. So Agile Retrospectives, a practical guide for catalyzing team learning and improvement. I'm going to walk through the 5 stages of a retrospective here that this diagram represents so that you all understand the best way of facilitating a retro from the beginning to end. What you see here is a figure 8. It's an infinite loop, right? And on the left-hand side of the diagram is the iteration. You're building something, you're releasing that, and you're learning from it. On the right-hand side is the retrospective. And you'll notice that the retro feeds information back into the iteration so that you can improve as a team. Now, the retrospective has 5 phases to it, and they're all inside the right-hand side of this figure 8. So those 5 phases are set the stage, gather data, generate insights, decide what to do, and close the retrospective. Here's how they work. The first one is set the stage. This is an opportunity briefly at the beginning of the retrospective to get everyone's voice out and to be heard. The simplest way to set the stage is just to ask, hey, how are you feeling right now, to everybody around the room? And everyone just goes and shares one word, sad, angry, frustrated, or maybe enthusiastic, excited, whatever the case may be. And you might wonder, well, what's the utility of that? Why take the time to do it? And there's actually research out there that proves that those individuals who speak up once at the beginning of a meeting are more likely to speak up again later on in the meeting. So if you're struggling to get engagement from your team, one very simple way to get engagement to increase is to just ask them a simple question that everyone can respond to at the beginning of the retro. So that's one example of set the stage. There's literally hundreds of other ways to do it. There's one. Okay, now we've welcomed everyone into the process. The next thing is to gather data. So many retrospectives that I'm in skip this phase and they go right to, hey, what are we going to do about X, Y, or Z? But gathering data is an important step. What it does is it helps us as a team build a shared mental model of just what happened. You'd be shocked at how many times people disagree on the facts. So here's an example. You might set up a timeline on your whiteboard, whether virtual or in person, asking everyone across the x-axis, which represents time, to write on sticky notes what happened over the past 2 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever period you're iterating on. And just put up the sticky notes. And you'll see how many people say, oh yeah, I forgot about that one from 2 weeks ago. I mean, I forget what I had for dinner last night, let alone what happened 2 weeks ago, right? So by taking the time to build a shared mental model of what happened, we're going to make sure that when we talk about, well, what can we do about it, we have the same set of facts to go on. So that's an example of gather data. And just like set the stage, there's hundreds of ways of doing that. It's just one. Then we have generate insights. So now that we have a shared set of facts, we can start to ask questions to better understand the data. These can be simple questions like, hey, when you look up at the board right now, what surprised you? Or do you see any patterns here that you were previously unaware of? Right? Simple questions. It can also go through exercises like 5 whys. Thumbs up if you've heard of 5 whys before as a technique. It doesn't have to be a retrospective technique, but just a technique generally to have a deeper understanding of things. So 5 whys, it doesn't have to be 5, but you just ask why again and again and again about an issue until you get to, in quotes, the root cause, or at least one of the root causes of why that thing occurred. So that's generate insights. Then there's decide what to do. Now that we've discovered something new that we didn't know before, let's figure out what we're going to do about it. So again, like the other phases, there's lots of ways of deciding what to do. One of the ways that I like is to use SMART action items, which again, probably many of you have heard of the acronym SMART. It stands for, who wants to type it into the chat? What does the S stand for? Or come off video or unmute yourself. Specific, great, okay. What about the M? Measurable, perfect, okay. A? Actionable, achievable. This is why I do this, because people always have different interpretations. There's different versions of SMART, but either achievable or actionable, great. R? Realistic, relevant. Okay, there's a couple other R's there. And then T, the last one. Time-bound, time-based, yeah. So one thing you might want to do if you use this technique when you're writing your action item is to make sure you and your team actually have the same understanding of what SMART means. There's no right or wrong here, but making sure you have a shared mental model of what that acronym means will help you build better action items. Okay, now we've decided what to do, and finally we close the retrospective, where we're just going to give an opportunity for the people on the team to check out of the experience that we went through collectively. So one example of that is what I'm going to ask you at the end of this talk is, can you give me some feedback on how did that go? So if you're a facilitator of a retro and you can tell people aren't that engaged in the experience, well, ask them why. What can I do better to make this a better experience for you? And that's a great way to check out of the retrospective to give you feedback to improve your performance going forward. If there's one slide I want you to walk away from today in this talk, it's this one. Learn about that process. Each one has lots of different activities that you can use. Learn to build custom retrospectives using that mental approach, that approach to facilitation, and you'll do yourself and your team wonders. Okay, let's keep moving through. So rule 2 is to zoom in on the dog nose. What? Zoom in on the dog nose? That sounds crazy. What does that even mean? So I don't know if any of you have seen this meme before. It's actually pretty old at this point. It's from 2017. And it was on a platform that we used to call Twitter. It's no longer called that anymore. So the platform doesn't even exist. It's replaced by something else, X. But okay, there's this meme and I loved it. It said zoom in on the dog nose. So there's this cute little dog. And okay, let's try to zoom in and let's see what happens. So I'm gonna, whoops, that's the wrong direction. Sorry, I'm gonna zoom in. So we get a little bit closer to the dog nose and maybe we can see there's something there. I don't know if you can tell that or not, but it's really unclear what it is, right? So let's zoom in again. Okay, now it's blurry, but maybe we can read it. It says, look in the bottom left corner. Okay, I did all that zooming. I have to try something else. So let me zoom over to the bottom left corner. And if we do that, there's his paw, this bottom left. It says, look in the top right corner. Oh, okay. Let's do it again. Top right corner, and it says, you are beautiful. Ah, right? The point of this being when you change perspective, you see different things. I'm going to come back to that again in a moment. Here's one more example. This is from the popular movie Finding Nemo. You can tell I have kids. Actually, I love that movie too. It's a great movie. I forget their names. That's Dory, and that's not Nemo because they're trying to find Nemo. Someone's going to type it in and remind me what that fish's name. Marlin. It's Marlin? Okay, we'll go with Marlin. So they're swimming in the sea, right? Nothing's going wrong. And then, well, bam, all of a sudden, there's this huge shark in front of them. So where you look changes things. So how does that apply to retrospectives? What am I getting at? Many times when we run a retrospective, we go in without a context. We say, hey, folks, what's going well and what's not going well, right? And you ask people to think about the past 2 weeks from that lens. And in my experience, it's actually really hard to do, to come out of whatever work that we're doing before, probably if you're an engineer, that's some hard technical challenge, and all of a sudden level up from there into, okay, meta conversation, what's going well and what's not going well about anything. It's really hard to do. So a more effective approach many times is to set a topic, a narrow topic to the retrospective that gives people a focus area for them when they start to brainstorm. Now, how might you do that in practice? So this is an example of a team radar, which is an activity you can use in your retrospective to get a better view into different aspects of a team's work. So there's 5 in this particular radar, 6 different spokes, technical skills and expertise, culture and values, scope and schedule, and more. And you just ask everybody, rate from 1 to 5, how you think the team is doing on each of those different aspects of its work, right? And you can write whatever you want for the spokes. These are just example ones. Collect that data and then graph it. Shouldn't take more than 5 minutes. Then you can figure out the average out of all the ratings that you get. And from that information, you can see that in this contrived example, the processes and practices of the team got the lowest rating of 1.8. So you can set a narrow focus to the retrospective of just our processes and our practices team, what's going well and what's not going well, because there's a lot of room for improvement here. And it takes just 5 minutes at the start of a retro to gather this data before you jump into that conversation. Plus, by providing that narrow focus, it actually gives people more of an idea of what to think about. This is a screenshot actually taken directly from Retrium. This is another example of how if you have an open whiteboard, building something like this is quite complex. It takes time, and it may not function that well. But if you have a product that helps you just use these techniques out of the box in one click, it makes it a lot easier to level up the experience that you have with your team. I'll give you one more interesting example from this radar diagram. You'll see that there's these gray curves overlaid on top of the spokes. They represent the normal distribution of the data. Blah, blah, blah. If you're not a statistician, don't worry about it. I'm not either. But the idea is that if there is a narrow amount of gray around a topic, like this one here, processes and practices, there's a lot of agreement that people tended to rate it around a 1.8. Whereas if it's very wide, like this one, tools and technology, some people rated it a 1, some people rated it a 5. Another way to pick a narrow focus for your retro is to find a topic with a big amount of disagreement. That would be interesting to piece apart. Why is it that some people think tools and tech is going well and other people think it's not going well? Let's run a retro just about that, okay? All right, rule number 3, facilitate open discussion. So no matter what facilitation techniques you use in your retrospective, eventually there's going to be time for people to just talk. And that doesn't mean that you as a facilitator can now sit down and have a coffee and just relax while everyone does the hard work. There's actually more work for you to do right then. The first thing to keep in mind is that silence is your friend. That sometimes the best thing you can do as a facilitator when there's silence in the room is to let the silence exist. I just counted to 5 in my head really slowly, and it's really awkward every single time, but it lets people rest and think. And sometimes introverts in particular need that pause to think, how do I want to proceed in this conversation? But it's actually useful for everybody. So as a facilitator, use silence. Don't fill in that silence with more talking. The other thing I'd like to say is to create invitations, don't force things. So I personally have been on the other side of this, and I hate it. It's when someone in a room, a group conversation will say, hey, David, what do you have to say about that? Well, if I had something to say, I would have spoken up already. And now I'm on the spot and I'm feeling really uncomfortable by the fact that I was just called out. That's forcing someone into the spotlight. Instead, you might try to create invitations. So for example, who else has an idea? That's an invitation to the room to start participating. And it's a great way of facilitating open conversation. Or any comments from someone who hasn't spoken in a while? Again, that's not, Joe, what do you have to say? It's, does anyone have anything more to share? It's much more pleasant, much more inviting, much more open. Are there any other perspectives on this? And you can come up with your own twist, whatever feels natural to you. But come up with these prompting questions. It will help you and the room participate more freely. They're broadly called powerful questions. They look like this. Questions that are open, like, how can we make this more fun, gang? Or, hey, what's possible here? You can read through more of these, but I have a link here at the bottom to, it's an agile coaching company in South Africa that has a deck of these in PDF format that I love. I think they're great. I cut them out, put them on index cards, and just bring them along with me, and I can just flip through them to help me remember prompting powerful questions for the gang, for the group that you're with. Okay, so to recap about facilitation, rule 1 is use facilitation techniques, right? Remember what happened when I literally did nothing? Facilitation matters. If you have skeptical people on your team, you can use that example to try to convince them. Rule 2 is to zoom in on the dog nose. Sometimes setting constraints on what we're supposed to be brainstorming about actually makes a lot of difference in opening up the brainstorming possibilities. And rule 3 is facilitate the open conversation, the open discussion. Your job's not done once the open conversation starts. All right, I'm going to pause again and open up for questions. What do we have?
Okay, I see a few questions in Slido. Tizzy asked about, can you talk about the okayness of doing the occasional off-piste retro? For example, appreciative inquiry format, or anything that doesn't tidily map onto what went well, what needs improvement.
Yeah, so first of all, I'd say that anything that works for your team is not just okay, it's great, right? So if you want to use appreciative inquiry as a method for your retrospectives and your team finds that to be helpful, then more power to you, go ahead and do it. What went well, what didn't go well tends to be the default for most teams, for most retrospectives, that or start, stop, continue. But there are literally hundreds of facilitation techniques out there that some of which have nothing to do with sticky notes. For example, the team radar that I showed before, where it's a data-based approach to a retrospective. And there are countless others like that. So I would encourage you to explore. If you look online for retrospective facilitation activities, you'll find countless resources. The book is also a great one. There's probably, 50 different activities in there across the 5 phases. So have at it. Use whatever works for you and your team.
And then another question, what are the general guidelines for the length of a retro? For like a 2-week sprint, what would you consider to be appropriate?
Yeah, there's different advice out there on this, including last I checked in the Scrum Guide. But the way I look at it is that you want to make sure that there's enough time, that there's a moment to have a deep conversation about one particular thing that's going on with your team. One thing, not 50 different things, not 10 things, and have a shallow conversation, but you want to have enough time to have a deep conversation about one thing, but not so much time that people say, I don't have the opportunity to show up. There's too much going on. So on average, if you spend about 1 hour per 2 weeks for your sprint, or 2 weeks of iteration, on average, that's going to work for you. But I've had teams that do 2-hour retrospectives for 1-week iterations because they really go deep and they get value from it. So this is very much a starting place, not an ending place. And just see what works for you and your team.
So Larry and Taylor both had a similar question about when getting people to speak up, and particularly Taylor called out when you know someone has something to say, but they're not responding to, does anyone have anything else? How can you draw people out without awkwardly pulling them in front of everybody?
Yeah, so don't awkwardly put them in front of everyone. There are other ways. So here's a couple. I could build a whole talk just about this. So here are a couple. One is breakout groups. So if you have a team of, let's say 10 people, get people to talk in pairs instead of in front of everybody. That person who might have shied away from sharing in front of the whole group will then share with just that one other individual. And now when you come back to the whole group, the other person might share that person's idea for them. So that person didn't have to speak in front of the whole group because they were uncomfortable, but the other person could share it for them. So that's one great way. Another great way, and I'll stop here, like I said, I could give a whole talk on just this. Another great way of doing that is to switch between verbal and nonverbal communication. So sometimes people don't want to speak up publicly with their mouth, but are more than happy to write something down. So if you started the retrospective with sticky notes, and now you're in the open conversation part of your retro, switch back to sticky notes. Let's go back to brainstorming, right, with stickies. There's no rule that says you can't do that. That person will then share the idea in a written format, and now it's there for the team to use. Just a couple thoughts. Okay, I'm looking at the clock. I want to keep going so we get through the next section and hopefully have time for more questions at the end also. So now we're on to the third leg of that triangle, which is follow through. So now we've gotten the right people in the room. We're following the 5 phases to an effective retro. We're facilitating open conversation. The retro finishes or is close to the end, and we're trying to make sure we have actionable follow through. What do we do? Here we go. Rule number 1, and this to me is the most important rule out of all of these, is to follow the energy. Okay, here's what I mean. The expected value, this is all my math people here in the room will like this. The expected value of an action item, you remember back from your probability days in school, the expected value of an action item is a function of, first thing is its impact. So how much impact will it have on whatever you're trying to change, right? That's one. The second thing is the effort that you have to put into it. So how much time will it take? How much will it cost for you and your team to work on this thing? But the most important one, the odds you will actually do it. Let that sink in for a moment. If you have something that has high impact and low effort, but for some reason the team has resistance to doing it, the expected value of that action item is basically 0. Okay, so how does that translate into how can you use that, right, in a real retro? Let's say you're brainstorming, here are 5 different things that we could try for solving this problem. And those are represented by these yellow sticky notes. They're blank intentionally. It doesn't matter what the content of them would be. It's the idea that matters. The team has brainstormed 5 candidate action items. The next thing that you can do is to ask folks to rate, using t-shirt sizes, nothing scientific, the impact of each of those. right? So based on just that information right now, it looks like this last one here is extra large impact. Let's do that one, right? Okay, but now let's keep going. Ask the team, well, how much effort is this thing going to take you? And they do the same thing with t-shirt sizes. So still, that last one, extra large impact, extra small effort, seems like a great thing for the team to work on. Okay, then the last part of this exercise is, how much energy does the team have to work on this? And you just put a little sticky note or a little dot vote next to the one you want to work on or you'll actually do. And it turns out, for whatever reason, the one in the middle here is the one the team has energy to work on. I would encourage you 99% of the time to pick the middle one in here because it'll actually get done. And a medium impact is much better than an extra large impact that actually isn't happening. So this is a facilitation activity that you can use during decide what to do towards the end of your retro to pick an action item that follows the energy of the team. Okay, rule number 2 is to focus on one thing at a time. This one's pretty simple to understand, but if your backlog looks like this, it's not easy to know what to work on. And similarly, if you come up with 10 different action items from 10 different shallow conversations in your retrospective and you put them on your board like this, guess how many are going to get done? It's almost certainly 0. So my recommendation to teams that are struggling with follow through, with actually changing something after the retro is over, is to have a targeted retro where you come up with one action item, just one, that the team really is committed to working on, and then close the retro. That's it. Now, there might be a lot of other important topics to discuss, but we're not going to talk about them today. We're focusing on just one thing, and then really work on it. And when it comes time for the next retro, as a team, you can decide, was that enough for us, or do we want to try to take on more work next time? In most cases, on most teams, what I've found is that one change item is enough for the team to feel like they've done something useful over the past 2 weeks as a result of their retrospective. And in fact, change is hard for all humans. I don't care who you are. So trying to change too much at once, sometimes in and of itself will cause the change not to happen. So focus on one thing at a time. We talked about being smart already. So the acronym of SMART, but I'm going to give you an example of what that actually means in practice. So many times when I see action items being written for teams, they look something like on the left. Hey, we're going to experiment with continuous integration, right? And that's your action item. Let's try again, folks, right? That's not smart. Let's try again. Here's how you might rewrite that in a smart way. In order to release our product on a more frequent basis, we will set up a continuous integration server before the end of the next sprint. We will know that we were successful when commits to the code are automatically pushed to the continuous integration server. Now, if I had more time, I would go through each one of these parts of the template here to talk about how it matched the SMART acronym. For now, just take my word for it. But that level of detail is what we're going for, because now we know exactly what's going to happen, who's going to do it, and when it's going to be done by, and how we're going to measure it. So much better than experiment with continuous integration, where when it comes time for next retro, it's debatable whether that happened or not. Someone might say we experimented and someone else might say, no, actually not. Get clarity up front. Okay, rule 4 is small wins are better than no wins at all. Change is hard, like I said before, and a lot of times we get stuck because we're tackling some big thorny problem that actually might not be solvable in the next iteration. So try to get some small wins under your belt. One facilitation technique to come up with an action item that's a small win, as opposed to tackling the whole issue, is something out of liberating structures called 15% solutions. If you haven't heard of liberating structures, you can go to their website. It's liberatingstructures.com. It's just a set of ways of organizing a group of individuals to accomplish certain things like brainstorming or coming up with actions and many, many other things. So 15% solutions look like this. As a facilitator, you might ask your team, hey folks, what's our 15% right now? Meaning, what do we have, so where do we have the discretion and the freedom to act without getting any sort of approval from anyone else, without needing to get any budget from anyone else? What's our 15%? And that can become code for what can we just do as a team to try to do something different than whatever we're doing now that's causing this problem? What's some small thing we can do? Some of the teams that I've been on start using that as just common lingo. Hey, what's our 15% right now? And everyone knows what that means. So keep things small, try to keep things in your control, and that way you can actually start making progress towards your goal. Okay, rule 5, this is the last one of this set, is to default to privacy and opt in to transparency. So earlier on in the talk, I forget the name of the person who mentioned this, but she said that you want to make sure whoever's invited to the retro is invited by the team, is actually bottom up volunteer. All these people are saying, yes, we want to invite that individual in. And so similarly, when it comes time to run your retrospective, when you are coming up with an action item, the things that you talk about in preparation for coming up with an action should be private to the team, right? We hear this all the time. If you ever gone to a conference and someone says, what happens in Vegas doesn't always stay in Vegas sometimes, right? This is the truth. It's the opposite of what we always hear. Or what happens in a retro doesn't always stay in a retro, like people start talking about it. What I like to say actually is that at the end of the retrospective, ask your team, hey, is there anything we discussed today that we want to intentionally share with whoever it might be? And if the answer to that is no, then default to privacy. Everything you're talking about in the retro is private. But if the answer to that is yes, then become intentional about how are we going to involve that other person who isn't here today to make this situation better. And the reason why this is part of the follow-through section of this talk is that so many of us who work at larger organizations encounter things that are out of our control. And if we just keep things private to our team and never share those with others outside of our team, they probably won't get fixed. So be intentional about keeping the psychological safety of a private conversation balanced with who are we going to bring in to the conversation when needed to help us solve this bigger issue. One way to do that is to come up with something called a retrospective radiator. You might have heard of information radiators, where we're trying to radiate as much information as broadly as possible out to whoever it needs to be radiated to. For example, a burn down chart that you might hang in your team room. A retrospective radiator is another instance of an information radiator where we're sharing from the retrospective things that the team has opted in to sharing with others in the organization. And you can categorize them however you want. This one is learnings, talk to us if, hypotheses and experiments, action items and impediments. The idea being we're sharing this with the org so that people know what we want them to know about what we've learned in the retrospective. Okay, so to recap, the 5 things are: 1, follow the energy. Do what the team has energy to do. That'll help you actually get change done. Rule 2 is to focus on one thing at a time. Don't bite off more than you can chew. Rule 3 is to be smart with how you write your action items. Rule 4 is small wins are better than no wins at all. So try 15% solutions. And rule 5 is to default to privacy, maintain psychological safety in your retro, but then give an opportunity for transparency when the time is needed. If you do all of that, then hopefully it'll help you get out of that vicious cycle that I talked about at the beginning, where retros lead to lack of follow-through leads to lack of engagement in the retro, and into a virtuous cycle where you're actually seeing retrospectives lead to change and success. Okay, I am going to leave you with this prompt to think through in your head, and then I'll open it up for questions, which is, out of everything that I just shared, what is one thing I'm going to try in my next retro? Right? Take that 15%. You don't have to do everything I just said. Take the 15% for you and your team and bring it back to your retro and see what happens. Okay, thank you, everybody. I'm happy to answer whatever questions there are at this point.
Okay, let's see. There was a few questions here. Let me pull it back up here. Somebody was asking if you have, if they can get a copy of your slides.
Sure, I'll send it to you, Mark. And
okay, I'll email it out to everyone. Somebody else asked if the chat is available. I think if you're signed in, you can actually see the list from the chat. I'll throw those links up there in just a minute. Let's see if they've got any other questions in here. If you want to put them either in Slido or just in the chat, I'm looking through them. Somebody's headed to Etsy to find their facilitator hat. Anybody have any questions? Matter of fact, feel free to just speak up too if that's easier than typing something out. Well, this is good. I love the idea of putting on a slide, what have we done over the last iteration, and making sure everybody has that visually where you can see it, because it's so easy to maybe not celebrate things. You've done more than you realize you did. That's great. I think that's the game team I've ever worked on. That'd be great for. Any other questions that we may have missed?
So Taylor raised their hand. Is that
okay?
Yes. Hey, David. Fantastic presentation. Thank you very much. Question I have. So when you're talking about the team has energy to work on something, I kind of think I understand what you're saying, but could you just elaborate on that a little, please?
Yeah, sure. So think about your own life for a moment, right? There's some things that you have to do that maybe your spouse is saying, and we should throw an example out here. Your spouse is saying, hey, can you take out the trash, right? And you kind of don't really want to, and so it waits a day or two, and then it gets even more annoying because you're waiting longer and it's just not getting done. That's an example of something that you don't have energy to do, and therefore it's not happening, even though the impact of it is kind of high. You need to get rid of the trash from your house, right? It sounds like you know my wife. There we go. In contrast, there are things that might be not so fun for some people, but for you, you get energized by doing them. As an example of that, some people don't like talking in front of big crowds. I actually get energy from doing this sort of thing. So for me, I'm always happy to get in front of people at a conference and give a talk. I get energy from doing it. And so I'm more likely to opt in to the experience of giving a talk. That type of thinking applies to a team also. The things that get done either are imposed by a boss or someone saying you have to do this, it's on your performance review, or they're the things that get done because the team is energized by doing them. They get prioritized as a result of that. And that's not so true. There's other reasons why things get prioritized, but broadly speaking, if you're energized by it, it'll get done. So a way to prioritize the change that you want the team to see and the change that the team wants itself to see is to ask itself, hey, what are we energized by changing, right? It could be that someone says, I know that's a problem. I just don't have the energy to work on, again, continuous integration servers right now. It just doesn't interest me. Well, then don't focus on that. Find something that has a less of an impact maybe for the team, but that does energize the folks. So does that help answer your question, Taylor?
Yes, it does. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Sure.
And what if, I love that, the chart that you had there and how to determine, what's the highest impact, effort and all that. What if it's something that's like really high impact and it's like, oh, we should definitely do this. And they're like, yeah, we just don't have the energy to do it. But you're like, guys, this is probably really, really important. We should do this.
Yeah. So who's the one saying should, right? If it's the Scrum Master, is it the
Well-
boss? Is it the team? Who's saying should in your
Well, I
example?
guess I'm saying the team has already said it because they said it has an extra large impact.
Yeah. So if the team is saying it has high impact, but for some reason doesn't have energy to work on it, you can't force them as a Scrum Master to work on something they don't want to work on. It's not your job, actually. Your job is to set up structures to help them realize for themselves what it is that they might want to work on. So if the team says this is important, but for some reason they don't have energy to work on it, they prefer to work on something else, they're self-organizing around that other thing. And it's not your job as the Scrum Master to redirect them.
Okay.
I would set up the structure and let people start playing within the structure. By the structure, I mean that chart of impact and energy and effort. Start introducing that with your team and see where they land. It might be that they come up with they realize some things about themselves that they didn't realize before around what energizes them and what doesn't, and therefore where to focus their efforts on. But your job is to set up that structure, not to, if you're the Scrum Master, not to force them to do something or not do something else.
Gotcha. Okay. That's great. Thank you.
What I love about having that out there is if there are discrepancies like that, it makes it very, very clear so you can have a conversation around it. Because if people are saying this is really important, but they have no energy, maybe it's a really bureaucratic process and that's what's making it hard. And no one wants to deal with the bureaucracy or something. And identifying that, I think, can go a long ways to finding ways to making progress. So I think that's great. Khalid Sultan, you ask what the best anecdotal instance you have seen from an implemented retro in your years with teams. So are you asking, you want to hear one of David's great success stories? I think that's what you're asking for.
Is that the question? The biggest
Not
success?
exactly, but like, a team turned everything around. They made a 180
Oh, cool.
after implementing that one or two things that they agreed on in the retro, and like productivity shot up, blah blah blah, and yada yada yada. They delivered the thing right. They delivered the right thing, yada yada yada. After that, like in your years of consulting, your years of experience with it, that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. So systems are complex. I want to first own that it's hard, if not impossible, to say, as a result of X, everything fixed itself, right? It would be intellectually dishonest for me to say the retrospective is exactly the reason why the team turned itself around. Systems are complex. There's lots of moving pieces in any team organization, any organization. It's always lots of factors. So I can't tell you for sure it is the retrospective that caused X, Y, or Z. With that said, I can tell you a story of a time when a team started to learn to run very effective retros. I'll tell you the format that they used too, and the impact that I think it had on that team. So this team was struggling with interpersonal relationships where there was just a lack of trust between people. And it got to the point where seemingly simple conversations led to locking horns and battles, right? Emotionally charged battles. I don't want to get into specifics of who and when and where. I'm going to kind of keep it high level. That team decided that they didn't want to continue to co-create the environment that they were co-creating, that they decided we're going to collectively own this. No blame on each other. We are all doing something together that's causing us to behave in this way. So let's try something different. And what they tried in a series of retrospectives was what I call FSE as an approach to retros: facts, stories, and emotions. So they tried to figure out what are the facts, the things that all of us, even though we vehemently disagree about this particular thing, what are the facts that we all agree on? And these had to be unarguable. So these are things that a video camera would record, or a microphone. Like, there's no debate. These things happen, period. Just an example of that is, I am talking to you right now on video. Like, that is indisputable. That is happening. Now, it's an opinion whether this is an effective talk or not, in either direction. But it's a fact that I'm giving a talk right now on video, right? So these are unarguable facts. That's the facts thing. Then they went to stories, which are, okay, now we all agree on what the unarguable facts are. What are the things we're making up about those facts in our heads that is causing this conflict? And when listing these things out, we're not going to try to convince each other that my story, the thing I'm making up, is right. I'm just listing out that, hey, this is what I believe about the fact that's causing this conflict. And they listed them out. And then last was emotions, which was based on the unarguable facts and based on the things we're making up about those facts. How is that making me feel? Just sharing the emotion. So facts, stories, and emotions. And by charting it in this way, and this was across 6 months, this was multiple retrospectives across 6 months, they were able to kind of unwind and start to understand and build empathy with one another about why there is so much conflict and where the lack of understanding came from. It came from believing that things were facts when they were actually stories that people were making up. It came from not understanding the emotional impact of the stories that people had about their facts. And so it's this long set of retros that helped people improve on that team and get to a place where they could function effectively as a team together. So that's a great example of how the facilitation technique helped elucidate things that weren't elucidated before and help that team improve.
I completely agree. That sounds amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing after the fact and really challenging during. Yeah.
Great question. And Anthony, I think you have your hand up. Did you have a question?
Yeah, real quick. Great talk, David, first of all. I like to use a straw voting technique to narrow down my team's suggestions for improvement to the 1 or 2 things that will make action items for the next sprint. In your experience, have you run into any downsides of using like everybody gets 3 votes, vote on, what you really want to work on for the next sprint? Any downsides to that?
No. So let me go back to that slide. In fact, that's pretty much what I have here. That right? If everyone gets 3 votes, you can put the dot votes here. I just call it energy because in my experience, again, if you don't have this energy column here and people are just voting on what makes the most sense, people tend to ignore it during the upcoming sprint because there's other stuff to work on. So the best way to get people to think through what are they actually going to do is to figure out where the energy in the room is. The other tip I'd give you there is come up with what we call an action item ambassador. Okay, this is someone, it's like the servant leader of the action item. They're not responsible for driving that change through. They're not responsible for success or failure of that change, but rather they're responsible for setting up the structures to make sure the team continuously works on it in the upcoming iteration. And that should be a volunteer position. It shouldn't be me saying, hey, Anthony, you are going to be the action item ambassador. It should be, hey, folks, who volunteers to be the ambassador today? And guess what? If no one volunteers, it's probably a sign that the energy in the room is low for that action item. So try to find something else.
And I call it my champion for change. So yeah, we're on the same page.
Perfect.
So
Love it. Yeah, great.
one other quick thing. There have been times where I only have one suggestion for improvement. And so what I've done is I create another card that says keep the status quo for now, because I didn't want 2 or 3 votes on something that one person came up with to have to lock in the whole team. I don't know if that was a good idea, because I've had situations where sometimes people say, no, leave it alone. We don't want to do that one suggestion kind of thing.
Yeah,
If that makes
sure.
sense.
That sounds like a great suggestion to me. I love it.
Oh, okay, cool. Thanks.
Cool. Well, we are at time, and I think we covered all the questions. Dave, thank you so much. This was awesome. And you send me those the slides. I'll get those out to everybody along with all the links you had, because I think a lot of people are looking to follow up on some things you mentioned and check out your book. But thank you so much for sharing. This has been a great. I've learned a tremendous amount. I really appreciate you taking the time to share with all of us.
Perfect. Well, I appreciated the invite, and thanks everyone for coming.
Everybody have a great rest of your week.
You.